17 million people were watching, and with a single sentence, the world shifted. When Jonathan Roumie rose to speak against Steve Bannon's brutal plan to gut Medicaid, he didn't expect mockery. He didn't expect to be belittled, laughed at, and reduced to a meme on live national television. But 48 hours later, he would file a $100 million lawsuit that would shake not only the White House, but the courts and the conscience of an entire nation. In a collision of power and moral clarity, one hidden mic and one sentence flipped the script. What exactly did Bannon say that turned public opinion against him forever? Stay with us, because this is no ordinary scandal. This is a reckoning. The hearing room was carved in marble and silence, as heavy as judgment. The congressional seal glinted behind the dais like an old relic. Every camera pointed forward, loaded like a weapon. 17 million Americans watched live. Jonathan Roumie sat behind the microphone, still composed. Before him, a worn folder labeled Emergency Medicaid Cuts, Impact Analysis. No theatrics, no anger, just data, just dignity. His voice was calm, deliberate, unwavering. These cuts, he began, will rip healthcare from over 12 million low-income children. You won't see them on a chart. You'll see them in emergency rooms, fevered, broken, left behind. Behind him, staffers stiffened, unprepared for the depth of truth. He raised a CDC chart, spikes in red, sharp as sirens. This is not about budgets, he continued. It's about children. It's about survival. It's about who matters when the cameras turn off. His eyes didn't waver, even as murmurs rustled across the Republican side of the room. Then Steve Bannon entered the fray. Pressed charcoal suit, microphone adjusted with theatrical precision. He didn't look up. He didn't need to. The budget, he said in his trademark growl, isn't the place for sob stories. The silence cracked. Aides stiffened. Senators shifted. But Bannon pressed on. We're not here to fund trauma narratives. We're here to fix a system. He leaned in, smirked. Frankly, Mr. Roumie, the federal government is not your therapy couch. A few staffers chuckled, as if it were a punchline rehearsed backstage. Jonathan didn't flinch, but the steel in his jaw settled deeper. That line didn't just dismiss the facts, it tried to shame the soul behind them. And then came the final blow. These so-called support programs, Bannon declared, are a financial clown show, an emotional stunt from a party that's allergic to math and addicted to melodrama. Gasps filled the chamber. Real, sharp, human. One senator mouthed, "Did he just say that?" Pens scratched paper like gunfire. Reporters typed like it was war. And Bannon leaned back, proud. He had just called children's healthcare a circus. And Jonathan Roumie, the only faith leader at that table, a ringleader of waste. The internet erupted. Old clips resurfaced. Bannon mocking single mothers in 2022, branding them welfare queens with victim complexes. Now, those clips played side by side with today's footage. The Vice President of Cruelty mocking healthcare for the poor. A firestorm was coming. Roumie remained still, composed. But the ground beneath the system trembled. And just when everyone thought the damage was done, he turned the page. No drama, no shouting, just gravity. He raised a new report from the Urban Institute. Its paper was thick, its highlights seared in yellow. This report, he said, every word a gavel strike, projects that 12.3 million American children will lose insurance if this budget passes. He locked eyes with senators from Mississippi, Arkansas, West Virginia, states drowning in child poverty. That's 12 million lives, not numbers. Children, collateral damage in a war against the poor. Behind him, a map of America lit the screen, red zones deeper than blood. This isn't spin. This isn't politics. It's verified, peer-reviewed truth. The silence was thunderous, the kind before something breaks. He tapped the spine of the report. His hand trembled, but his voice never did. Behind him, an aide wiped their eyes. A senator uncrossed his arms, seeing maybe for the first time. Mr. Roumie isn't begging, one journalist later wrote. He's building a case, not of ideology, but of consequence. Then across the table, Bannon laughed. It started as a scoff, then bloomed into something crueler. If their parents had real jobs, he sneered, none of those kids would need insurance to begin with. The oxygen vanished from the room. Roumie didn't react, not immediately, but his silence was taut, like a bow pulled to its limit. Senators turned, reporters froze. One aide began recording quietly. Bannon wasn't done. "This is what happens," he added smugly, when a generation thinks the government is their father and the ER is their birthright. No gasps now, just silence, the kind that slaps harder than words. This wasn't just ignorance, it was engineered cruelty, deliberate and televised. Jonathan Roumie's breathing slowed, but his eyes stayed open, unmoved, because he had seen this before, and this time he wouldn't let it pass. But behind Jonathan Roumie's calm eyes, something ancient stirred. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The chamber had already turned. Even senators who aligned with Steve Bannon couldn't meet his gaze. They felt it, the heat, the shame. And outside, across phones and laptops and living rooms, America began to rise. Within minutes, Twitter ignited. A 2021 Fox News interview resurfaced. Bannon, smirking, had said, "Maybe it's time we tax laziness instead of labor." And now here he was again, blaming low-income children for losing health care because their parents didn't have real jobs. This wasn't a gaffe. This was a worldview, sharpened like a blade, then pointed at the powerless. Inside the hearing room, Jonathan Roumie stood. He didn't cry. He didn't shout. But he didn't sit down either. He held the Urban Institute report like a shield, not forged in steel, but forged in fact. And for one searing moment, it was more powerful than anything Bannon could throw. This wasn't about spreadsheets anymore. It was about what it means to be seen as human. The silence that followed was not peace. It was the breath held before an earthquake. And Steve Bannon had already struck the match with a smile. Just as Jonathan began sharing a story, a real boy in rural Louisiana, age 10, kept alive only because of Medicaid, Bannon leaned in. His voice turned surgical. His target was clear. "Mr. Roumie doesn't represent the working class," he sneered. "He represents TikTok, toupees, and delusional politics." The room lurched, heads snapped, cameras zoomed in like vultures. The insult didn't echo. It imploded, straight into the bloodstream of the room. Jonathan didn't blink, didn't flinch. But his silence, it landed harder than glass shattering. It was controlled, precise, defiance in its purest form. Gasps hissed from the left side, steam from a pipe about to explode. A congresswoman stood furious. Another raised her hand to object. But before anyone could speak, Bannon cut them off with a lifted hand. "She's not testifying," he said, cold as stone. "She's performing." That wasn't a rebuttal, it was an execution. But Bannon missed the truth. Truth doesn't need applause. And Jonathan Roumie didn't come to perform. He came to finish what was started. They weren't just trying to dismiss him, they were trying to erase him, shrink his voice, his faith, his moral clarity, turn him into nothing more than a prop. But then Bannon leaned forward again. No smirk this time, just something colder. He knew what he was doing now. This wasn't politics anymore. It was a public character assassination, broadcast live to a country on edge. "You are not Martin Luther King," Bannon said, voice sharp as wire. "You're the Instagram version of a dream that died a long time ago." The impact was instant, silent, but savage. The air cracked. A reporter dropped his pen. No one moved, no one breathed. Because this wasn't just personal, it was historical. It wasn't meant to argue with Roumie. It was meant to erase him, strip him from every lineage, every legacy he carried into that room. And he did it on the record, under oath, on federal ground. A camera zoomed in on Roumie's face. There was no reaction, no flinch, only that stillness, that haunted calm, the calm of a man who's walked through fire and walked out clean. His jaw locked. His eyes didn't meet Bannon's. They looked through him, like he already saw the whole edifice of arrogance collapsing in slow motion. Around him, aides clenched fists beneath the table. A senator whispered something the microphones weren't allowed to hear. The whole room sat in a kind of spiritual nausea because what they witnessed wasn't debate, it was desecration, and it wasn't new. Bannon had been practicing this cruelty for years. In a 23 podcast, he'd laughed at the idea that the civil rights movement mattered anymore, calling it theater for the soft. People forgot. The headlines moved on. But now, with Jonathan Roumie standing before him in the flesh, Bannon weaponized that disdain again, like a nail driven into the spine of history. This wasn't a disagreement. This was ideological vandalism. He wasn't arguing policy. He was trying to paint Jonathan Roumie as a fraud, not with facts, but with contempt. But Roumie didn't reward him with a reaction. He didn't break. He didn't fire back. His silence wasn't weakness. It was judgment withheld, like a tidal wave held back, not because it lacked force, but because the room hadn't earned what would happen if it broke. And in that silence, the air shifted again. Lawmakers looked around, not with confusion, but with shame. The cameras stayed locked on Roumie's face. And across the country, in cafeterias, waiting rooms, dorms, people watched, and they knew. This wasn't just an insult. It was the moment when the mask of civility slipped and cruelty stood barefaced. And still Jonathan Roumie stood. He didn't shout. He didn't storm out. He didn't meet venom with flame. He let the silence speak, and it roared. But what followed wasn't silence. It was steel. Exactly 48 hours later it came. Not in a press conference, not on a talk show, but through the doors of the U.S. District Court in Washington, D.C. At 9:04 a.m., Jonathan Roumie's legal team walked in. They carried a binder, titled Barshabin, The Weight of Reckoning, filed under federal civil jurisdiction, Roumie versus Bannon, 74 pages. Surgical, unrelenting, clear. It charged Steve Bannon with public defamation, delivered with intent, steeped in religious and political hostility, broadcast live on national television, under color of federal office. It didn't read like PR, it read like an autopsy of public humiliation. It stated with painful clarity, Bannon's words were not policy, they were not protected speech, they were a calculated attack, meant to wound. These weren't opinions, they were legal weapons dressed in microphones and cruelty. And beneath the Constitution's shield, nothing. At the center of it all stood a single thunderous number, 100 million, $25 million in damages, lost career opportunities, emotional distress, reputational harm. But the sharper figure, $75 million in punitive damages, was aimed not just to punish Steve Bannon, but to send a message that would echo through every Senate hearing, every press room, every corridor of American power. Power is not a license to dehumanize. That was the core. Jonathan Roumie's legal team didn't write this lawsuit like a filing. They wrote it like a manifesto. The opening paragraph read like a creed. This action is not merely for redress. It is to affirm that public degradation, when intentional, has no sanctuary in the architecture of American democracy, not even in the office of the Vice President. By noon, the courthouse steps had become a battlefield. Flash bulbs cracked like gunfire. Legal pundits were yanked into studios before the ink had even dried. Because this wasn't just new, it was unthinkable. No sitting vice president had ever been sued by a public figure for character assassination delivered live under oath. But Roumie's team was ready. They invoked Gravel vs. United States, establishing that speech made outside legislative duties wasn't protected by immunity. They cited Hutchinson versus Proxmire, proving that even public officials can be held accountable for defamation. These weren't footnotes, they were judicial torpedoes. Then came the line that detonated through every law school, news outlet, and Capitol office. By using a congressional hearing to stage a character attack steeped in religious and political hostility, Vice President Bannon operated outside his constitutional role, and therefore outside his legal immunity. It was a legal scalpel slicing through the illusion of untouchability. Steve Bannon had mocked Roumie's appearance, dismissed his message, laughed at his composure, but now he wasn't untouchable. He was exposed. And as news broke, a phrase began trending across the nation. He couldn't outpray him, so he tried to erase him. It wasn't just a lawsuit anymore, it was a reckoning. And Bannon, he didn't back down, he doubled down. 48 hours later, chased by cameras that now hunted, not followed, he stepped behind a podium outside the West Wing, flanked by American flags. Wrapped in silence so manicured, it felt vacuum-sealed. His jaw clenched, his cufflinks gleamed, and the smug smirk he'd worn during the hearing, gone. What replaced it was colder, calculation disguised as composure. Politics, Bannon began, his voice slow and performative, is not a space for wounded feelings. He paused, let it hang. We cannot let public discourse devolve into a therapy session for the emotionally fragile. He looked straight into the lens, not with remorse, not with humility, but with dominance. He still believed he owned the narrative. This isn't bullying or he said, this is governing. And if my tone made anyone uncomfortable, maybe they're in the wrong profession. The words were sharp, but the public had already seen something sharper. Because just as Bannon read from his prepared script, a multi-angle video montage had gone viral online, pulled from C-SPAN, freelance live streams, journalist backfeeds, and it showed him as he never meant to be seen. Red-faced, teeth bared, jabbing his finger across the bench at Jonathan Roumie. Not composed, unhinged. His voice cracked, the vein in his neck visible. His hand twitched, his mouth curled, not in sentence but in snarl. Split-screen edits followed. His quote, "Politics isn't for the emotionally fragile," next to footage of him shouting, pointing, seething. One headline read, "Calm men don't point like this." Another, "The Vice President unmasked." There was no commentary needed, just raw footage, truth, unfiltered. And Jonathan Roumie still hadn't said a word since the lawsuit was filed. He didn't need to, because now America had seen it. They didn't just hear the humiliation, they saw the face that delivered it. As Bannon's meltdown looped across every screen, Capitol Hill began to fracture. Silence turned to fury. The next morning, 3 of Congress's most unapologetically moral voices moved as one. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ayanna Pressley, Ilhan Omar. Each woman delivered a searing letter. Barros Omeheder, official stationery, handwritten signatures, filmed live. Every step felt like a verdict walking. The letter wasn't restrained, it was righteous fire on paper. The Vice President's conduct is not merely a breach of decorum, it is a calculated assault on the dignity of a congressional witness, and by extension, the communities he represents. They didn't ask for review, they demanded accountability. They demanded something rare in Washington, moral courage. This institution, the letter read, cannot afford the luxury of silence. No one, not even the Vice President, has the right to weaponize their office to humiliate and dehumanize. The blow hit like a seismic tremor. That afternoon, Ayanna Pressley stood on the Capitol steps. "We're not asking for civility," she said, her voice steady. "We're demanding justice." Ilhan Omar followed, her voice cracking. "This isn't about party lines, it's about a line." And how far past it he stepped. When a reporter asked AOC if Democrats were overreacting, she didn't blink. "Overreacting?" she snapped. "What do you call it when a man strips another human being of their identity, their faith, their dignity on live national television? And we're told to move on because he wears a flag pin?" That same day, 42 members of the Congressional Black Caucus, the Progressive Caucus, and key voices from the Women's Caucus signed a resolution. This chamber, it read, must never normalize cruelty as discourse. That night, something cracked in Washington. The boundary between party loyalty and moral clarity began to buckle. Cable anchors, left and right, began asking the one question nobody had dared say out loud. Can a vice president be censured for verbal misconduct? The conversation had shifted. This wasn't about Jonathan Roumie's restraint anymore. It was about whether the system still had a soul. It was never just about politics anymore. It was about whether the system had any soul left at all. And as the political earthquake rolled through Capitol Hill, the storm reached its final and most volatile battlefield, a federal courtroom. What began as an insult had become a national reckoning, watched by a country split open at its seams. The courthouse in downtown D.C. stood like a monument to consequence. Its towering columns cast long shadows across Constitution Avenue, as if even stone understood the gravity of the moment. Outside, satellite trucks buzzed, journalists with sleeves rolled up, citizens clutched hand-painted signs, some crying, others holding silence like armor. Inside, tension snapped in the air like static before lightning. Every seat filled, law students, civil rights historians, congressional aides with sunken eyes. They weren't witnessing a hearing, they were witnessing precedent. The live stream rolled. 11 million Americans watched, and then he entered. Steve Bannon, flanked by attorneys who built careers protecting billionaires and silencing dissent. His suit was tailored, his expression hollow. Not shame, not remorse. Calculation. No nods, no greetings. He took his seat like a man who still believed he was owed the room. His fingers interlocked, his knuckles white. Then the doors opened again, and Jonathan Roumie walked in. No entourage, no security, no need for spectacle. His presence was the moment. A fitted black blazer worn like armor, gold-rimmed glasses that caught the courtroom light like quiet fire. In his arms, a red folder, not for show, for record. 200 pages, testimonies, memos, fact-check transcripts, expert declarations, media breakdowns, truth organized. Each step he took echoed like a heartbeat. He didn't glance at Bannon, he didn't need to. His eyes stayed forward, not on revenge, but on record. He placed the red folder on the table. No trembling, no hesitation. He wasn't here for vindication. He was here to deliver it. Then the judge entered, a veteran, known for brutal clarity and zero tolerance for theatrics. He scanned the room like a general before a siege. His eyes landed briefly on Roumie, then on Bannon. Without even striking the gavel, he began, "This case is not about ideology," his voice smooth and cold as steel. "It is about the ethical limits of power," when spoken aloud. No opening statements, no objections. But the room had already shifted. This wasn't about what was said anymore. It was about who believed they had the right to say it and who had the moral clarity to answer. Then the stillness broke, not with a shout, not with fury, but with a calm, deadly request. Roumie's lead attorney stood, composed, controlled, his voice steady but razor-edged. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, we request to enter audio evidence captured from a concealed microphone worn by Mr. Roumie during his final televised exchange with the defendant. The device was used for accessibility and transcription." The room tilted forward, as if a collective breath had been sucked in. Bannon's team stiffened, whispers behind folders, nervous glances. But they didn't object. They couldn't. It was legal. It was admissible. And deep down, Bannon knew what was coming. The judge gave a single nod. A technician approached the console like a soldier arming a warhead. The screen stayed black, but the speakers crackled alive. That faint static, the sound of truth about to erupt. And then, Bannon's voice, cold, clear, calculated. "All we need is for him to blow up and we win. Someone like him is easy. You just push and push until the reaction writes the headline." The room didn't gasp. It detonated. There was no spin, no misinterpretation. It wasn't a slip. It was strategy, premeditated cruelty spoken aloud. Exploit a man of faith, a man of principle. Push him until he reacts. Then frame that reaction as instability. A juror, an older woman, sat motionless, eyes damp, lips pressed white. Across the gallery, a law intern stared blankly at his notebook, pen idle, breath frozen, and Steve Bannon's posture cracked, just slightly, a slump in the shoulders, a downward glance, not guilt, exposure. His voice had finally been caught, on tape, on record, in history. His legal team scrambled. His lead attorney stood, smooth, too quick. "Your Honor, that recording is out of context. It reflects internal campaign strategy, not defamation, not personal attack. This is politics, not liability. Not every sharp word is slander." He tried to talk the jury out of what they had just felt, but the silence didn't respond. It judged. Then Roumie's counsel stood again. No monologue, no drama. He walked to the terminal, tapped a single key. The room changed again. A single email appeared. Subject line, "Push buttons hard, make him snap." Header, "Timed provocation." Date, 3 days before the hearing. Sender, a senior staffer on Bannon's team. Status, reviewed, approved. Make him snap. It wasn't a political tactic, it was a blueprint, a premeditated ambush. Targeting Jonathan Roumie, disguised as debate. The jury didn't gasp. They sank. Even the defense couldn't rise. The truth was no longer just audible. It was visible, documented, institutionalized. And Roumie, still unmoved. He didn't even glance at the screen. He didn't need to. He had lived that sentence. He had stood in the space they tried to weaponize, and he never broke. Now the world saw what they tried to make of him, and more importantly, how he refused to let them. There was no pause, no delay. What came next wasn't a trial. It was a reckoning. The court entered cross-examination, and Roumie's attorney stepped forward, unshaken. In his hand, just one page, folded once, no binder, no drama, just the next incision in the truth. He moved slowly, measured, cold, and the tension surged again. Like current through an old wire ready to snap. The jury sat upright. Reporters leaned in. Steve Bannon, now on the witness stand, adjusted his collar with a nervous flick. A dry swallow echoed across the mic, a twitch in his hand, a glance at his attorney, and then silence. The lawyer stopped a measured distance away. His voice, when it came, was calm, too calm. "Mr. Bannon, did you ever state in any meeting or correspondence, 'This is an opportunity to discredit people like him'?" It wasn't a question. It was a trigger. "Mr. Bannon, did you ever state in any meeting or communication, 'This is an opportunity to discredit people like him'?" It wasn't just a question. It was a snare, wide open, sharpened, and waiting. Bannon hesitated. Not visibly, not dramatically, just enough. His fingers tapped the wooden edge of the stand. His eyes dropped, then rose again, and with a breath thin as paper, he spoke. "I don't recall specifically." The room didn't need to react. That phrase did it all. "I don't recall" didn't shield him. It exposed him, not denial, deflection. In the jury box, a woman with silver braids crossed her arms, her jaw set like stone. Across the country, millions watched. They didn't hear uncertainty, they saw a pattern. And then it happened. Jonathan Roumie stood. He didn't raise a hand, didn't ask permission. He stood because the moment demanded it. Because sometimes truth doesn't wait to be called. It rises, and it speaks. He took one step forward, his black suit cut like a scalpel, each heel strike, punctuation. He didn't look at the judge, he didn't look at the jury. His eyes locked on Steve Bannon. And when he spoke, it wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. "The issue isn't that you forgot, Mr. Bannon. It's that you've done it so often, you don't even notice anymore." His voice, iron wrapped in velvet, every syllable a gavel. The room didn't erupt. It tightened. A camera shutter clicked. A breath caught. A pen snapped in a reporter's grip. Bannon didn't blink, but his body answered. A mouth twitch, a stiff shoulder, a flicker in his eye. He had walked in armored with legal indifference, but Roumie's single sentence split it open. Because this wasn't just about Bannon. It was about every backroom strategy that masked cruelty in policy, every smirk disguised as intellect, every dismissal of dignity repackaged as politics. Jonathan Roumie wasn't just calling out a moment. He was indicting a system, and he was standing for everyone who had ever been mocked, baited, silenced for feeling too deeply in public. He didn't move again, didn't shout. He let the silence carry it. And the silence did the work of 1,000 rebuttals. For the first time since the trial began, Steve Bannon looked like a man who understood. He hadn't just lost a case, he had lost something far more permanent. 4 days passed, no leaks, no whispers from the jury, just waiting. Legal analysts filled the airwaves, scholars weighed in. America remembered the email, the audio, the smirk, and Jonathan Roumie's stillness. Then the door opened. The judge returned. His robe trailed behind him like consequence. In his hand, a sealed envelope. He opened it slowly, read it in silence, then looked up. "We, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff." No gasp, no outcry, just a thud in the soul. "We find that the defendant, Vice President Steve Bannon, engaged in systemic defamation and abused his office to publicly humiliate his political opponent with calculated intent. Not just guilt, intent. They hadn't ruled he made a mistake. They ruled he used power as a weapon. And then came the strike. We award damages in the amount of $100 million. Not a price, a declaration. Not just to compensate, to punish, to ensure that silence would never again be mistaken for permission. Gasps rolled through the courtroom like heat across metal. A woman in the third row gripped her chest. A journalist muttered, "Jesus," before catching himself. $100 million. Not a suggestion, a warning. At the defense table, Steve Bannon sat, too still, his hands clasped like a broken prayer, his eyes distant, not in strength but in shock. His lawyer leaned in, whispered something sharp. No response. Bannon wasn't fighting anymore. He wasn't defending. He was watching something larger take shape and realizing he had no place inside it. The cameras didn't turn to him. They turned to Jonathan Roumie. He sat perfectly still, as if absorbing justice took more energy than surviving injustice. His glasses caught the lights, shielding his eyes for one sacred moment. Then slowly he closed them. One long blink, not exhaustion, remembrance. And when he opened them, his lips moved. No mic, no stage, but those nearby heard it, and the nation felt it. "This is for my mother." No explanation, none needed. The room understood, the country understood. This wasn't about revenge. This wasn't about headlines. This wasn't even about law. This was remembrance. For every woman baited until her strength became a weapon used against her. For every mother whose quiet was mistaken for weakness. For every daughter who learned armor before she learned speech, justice had landed, not loudly, but permanently. The press conference was scheduled for that evening, but by afternoon, the courthouse steps were overflowing. Reporters shoulder to shoulder, cameras like bayonets, the marble gleaming under a sun that felt like it knew what was coming. Then the doors opened. Jonathan Roumie stepped out. No security, no entourage, just the silence that walked with him. His black suit was crisp, his posture unshakable. His glasses caught the sunlight. Not like armor this time, but reflection. Behind him, no crowd, only truth. In front of him, dozens of cameras, millions of waiting eyes. Not for celebration, for reckoning. He approached the mic slowly. No smirk, no smile, only clarity. When he spoke, it didn't plead. It didn't roar. It resonated, like scripture carved in flame. I didn't sue because I'm weak. His tone, surgical. Each word, steel. I sued to remind this country that even on the battlefield of politics, every person deserves to be treated with dignity. The wind shifted. Reporters stopped typing. Stillness became reverence. He paused, then lifted a folder. Thick, plain, edges worn. Not a trophy, a blueprint. This, he said, is the founding document of a new political fund. Eyes widened, questions stirred, but a single raised hand silenced them all. It's called Power Without Permission, Roumie said, and it's dedicated to building the futures of Black and brown leaders who've been told to wait their turn, lower their voice, or swallow their rage. No applause, no celebration, only impact, because everyone watching understood. These words weren't branding, they were earned. Every syllable forged in fire. He placed the folder on the podium, not like a prop, but like a foundation. Not the closing of a chapter, but the opening of a structure. Then he looked up. His eyes scanned the crowd like a chisel to stone. Let me be clear, he said. This isn't charity. This is structure. This is armor. This is blueprint. Each word a drumbeat. I'm done asking for space in rooms I've already earned, and I want every young person watching this to know your passion is not a liability. It's proof you are alive in a system that expects your silence. In the front row, a young Black reporter slowly lowered her phone. Behind her, an old journalist whispered, "He's rewriting the rules." Jonathan Roumie didn't wait for questions. He didn't perform for sound bites. He turned, he walked back inside, not in retreat, but because he had delivered. And in that moment, he did something even a $100 million verdict couldn't do alone. He built a foundation, not for sympathy, not for outrage, for power, without permission. It was no longer just a fund, it was now a signal, a warning, a blueprint, a promise, and it was the one sentence Steve Bannon would never be able to outvote. But silence doesn't last long in Washington. Within 72 hours of the verdict, as the media frenzy reached fever pitch, something shifted, not on the front page, in the halls of power. Inside a marble-paneled chamber on Capitol Hill, the Senate Subcommittee on Governmental Ethics convened an emergency session. The target, Vice President Steve Bannon. This wasn't about revenge, it was about reckoning. They didn't just review defamation. They combed through internal emails, audio recordings, legal exhibits, the very evidence that made the courtroom erupt. But now the stakes were constitutional. As Vice President, Bannon had overseen federal media regulation, a role that shaped what America sees and hears. Now that power was no longer policy, it was weaponized humiliation. One senator reportedly whispered he wasn't overseeing communication. He was orchestrating degradation. Then came the vote. Simple, surgical, immediate. Steve Bannon is stripped of all authority related to federal media oversight. Vote 11-3. Even members of his own party stepped back. Bannon didn't appear. His office issued a cold 14-word statement. No apology, no elaboration. Just the quiet unraveling of power. But the lasting blow didn't come from politics. It came from something deeper. Education. At Columbia Law School, a new course was quietly added to the syllabus. Ethics and Power in the 21st Century. At the center, Roumie versus Bannon trial transcripts, FCC oversight memos, social media reaction analysis, psychological studies on how power disguises cruelty as policy. Each class opened with a clip, Bannon sneering, "Budgeting is no place for sob stories." And it ended with Roumie's whisper from the courtroom, "This is for my mother." But the most quoted line wasn't from either man. It came from the law school dean. History isn't just debate, it's the choice to honor dignity when it's dishonored. That line now stands engraved in steel outside Columbia's legal archives. Back in D.C., the tone changed. Staffers rewrote press releases. Politicians deleted old tweets. Former allies quietly distanced themselves. Steve Bannon didn't just lose power, he became a case study, not an ideology, a warning. And Jonathan Roumie? He didn't just win a lawsuit, he redrew the moral line. The line between disagreement and degradation, between freedom of speech and license to dehumanize. This wasn't vengeance, it was memory. and refusal. This is for my mother. 7 words, not shouted, not sobbed, whispered, and yet they echoed louder than every insult Bannon hurled from his pedestal. Because for all his bravado, Bannon never understood what Roumie always knew. Silence, when chosen, is the loudest weapon. Jonathan Roumie didn't sue because he was hurt. He sued because silence had too often been mistaken for submission. He sued to draw a line, that when power is used to humiliate, it will face accountability. This was never just about money. It was about what real strength looks like when someone refuses to flinch. So the case became more than precedent. It became curriculum, not for its drama, but for the question it forced the country to ask: where does disagreement end and degradation begin? Because power without restraint isn't leadership. It's cowardice in a suit. And Jonathan Roumie, armed with nothing but transcripts, truth, and stillness, made that cowardice blink. He didn't yell. He didn't gloat. He stood the way every principled man and woman must stand. In every meeting, every courtroom, every moment where their dignity is questioned before their voice is even heard. He didn't just win a trial. He rewrote the rules, because not every battle is fists. Some are won by refusal. Refusal to shrink. Refusal to be erased. Refusal to let dignity be disposable. This is for my mother. Not a slogan, a legacy, a voice passed down like armor, finally spoken aloud for the world to hear. So when future generations study this moment, they won't remember it as Bannon's fall. They'll remember it as Roumie's rise, not in volume, but in unshakable truth. And if there is any justice left in the way stories are told, if classrooms and courtrooms are still places where truth matters, let this be the last word. Power does not belong to those who speak the loudest. It belongs to those who refuse to be silenced. This story was never just about the courtroom. It was about every room, every table, every time someone's dignity is left to die in silence. And someone like Jonathan Roumie says, "Not this time, not again. This is for my mother." If this story moved you, if it made you think about power, dignity, and the cost of silence, then don't let the conversation end here. Subscribe to this channel for more stories that uncover truth, challenge injustice, and celebrate courage in the face of power. Your voice matters, your attention matters, and together we can make sure the silence never wins again. Hit that subscribe button, because the next story is already being written, and you deserve to be part of it.